She hid that she was blind in one eye. He discovered it only after she saved his life. The jar of honey was what I remember first. Not the woman, not the house, not the smell of wood smoke cutting through the October cold. The jar, small amber, sitting on the corner of a pine table that had been scrubbed so many times the grain had gone silver. I don't know why a man in the condition I was in, half my blood on the ground between the barn and her door, would fix on a jar of honey. But I did. I remember thinking, somebody here tends to things. Somebody cares whether things survive the winter. That's all I thought before I went down. My name is Caleb Dross, and I am 61 years old, and I have been a lot of things in my life, none of them easy to explain to a decent person. I scouted for the army when I was barely old enough to shave. I tracked men for money across 3 territories, some of them guilty, some of them not, and I learned early not to ask too hard about which was which because the answer sometimes came back ugly. I worked cattle drives up from Texas before the rail lines made that kind of work as obsolete as a buggy whip. I have slept under more open sky than I have slept under roofs. I have been shot at more times than I can count, and hit enough times that I quit counting. What I was by the fall of that year was finished. Not dead, just finished. The ranch I'd been working for over near the Laramie Range, I won't name it, it doesn't matter, had been using me the way men like that use a hammer. You pick it up when you need something driven in. You set it back down when you're done. I've been doing work for them that I am not proud of, work that needed doing in their estimation and that I was qualified for by a lifetime of hard choices. And when things got complicated, when the wrong people started asking questions about cattle counts and range disputes and 2 men who turned up dead the previous spring, the hammer got set down quick, quietly. They stopped returning my telegrams. One of their hands told me, the last time I rode up to the main house, that Mr. Taggart wasn't available and wasn't expected to be available. And the way the kid said it, looking somewhere past my left ear the whole time, told me everything I needed to know about how this was going to go. I wasn't surprised. I'd seen it before. Men like Taggart don't ever stand next to men like me when the wind shifts. That's just a fact of what I was. What surprised me was that I let it happen again. That after everything, all the years, all the knowledge I'd accumulated about the way these arrangements tend to end, I had still walked into it with my eyes mostly open, and told myself this time would be different. That was the thing I couldn't shake as I rode north along the creek bottom in the last of October, in the cold, with the names of 2 dead men sitting in my chest like stones. The men who shot me were not hired by Taggart. I want to be clear about that, not to protect him, but because it's the truth and I am trying to get the truth down right. They were the brothers of one of those dead men. Holt was their name, 3 of them, and they'd been looking for me since March. I'd known it and I'd been careful, and I got careless for about 40 seconds on a ridge above the creek, and 40 seconds is all it takes. 2 rounds. One took me through the meat of my left side, just below the ribs, in and out clean, which was the one mercy. The other caught my right shoulder and broke something in there. I could feel it, a grinding that made my vision white out every time I moved my arm. I got off the ridge on my horse mostly because the horse had more sense than I did and headed downhill on her own. I was leaning so far over her neck that I must have looked like a man sleeping on horseback, except for the blood. The Holt brothers didn't follow. Whether they thought I was finished or whether they were just cautious, I couldn't say. I didn't look back. There wasn't any point. The horse found water. That's the only reason I can account for ending up on Celestina Vera's property, because I wasn't navigating at that point. I was just holding on. She had a creek that ran behind the barn, and my horse smelled it, and that creek led to a water trough, and the water trough was in the yard, and the yard was where I fell off. I remember the cold of the ground. I remember thinking, well, this is probably it then. And I remember, before everything went dark, that jar of honey in the window. I came back in pieces. Heat first, a wood stove close by radiating in waves. Then pain, which announced itself not as a sharp thing but as a presence, something that had moved in and rearranged the furniture while I was gone. Then a smell, something medicinal, sharp, piney. Juniper I'd find out later. She'd packed the wound with it. Then her voice. She wasn't talking to me. She was talking to herself, or maybe to no one in particular, the way people who live alone get accustomed to doing. Saying something low in Spanish, just a few words, and then she moved into my line of sight, and I got my first look at Celestina Vera. She was somewhere in her late 40s. Hair the color of black river silt shot through with gray at the temples, pulled back from a face that had been out in the weather long enough that it had settled into something that I can only describe as decided. Not hard, decided. There's a difference. Hard is what happens to a person who loses the argument. Decided is what happens when they stop having it. She was wearing a plain gray dress and a canvas apron, and she was carrying a folded cloth that had blood on it, my blood, it turned out, from the shoulder, and she set it on the table and looked down at me the way you look at a busted fence post. Assessing. Not unkind, but not soft either. "You're awake," she said, in English which surprised me slightly. "Appears so," I said. "Don't move your shoulder. I've bound it, but the bone is cracked, and if you move it, you'll have it to do over." I didn't move my shoulder. She brought water. I drank. She took the cup back and refilled it and set it on the floor where I could reach it without raising my arm, and then she pulled a stool over and sat down and looked at me again. "Who shot you?" she said. "3 brothers named Holt." "Do they know where you are?" "No." She seemed to weigh that. "Are you sure?" "Sure enough," I paused. "If I'm wrong, I apologize in advance." Something shifted at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile. An acknowledgement, maybe, that the remark was made. "What's your name?" she said. I told her. "I'm Celestina Vera," she said. "This is my land. My husband built this house. He's been dead 6 years. She said it the way you state a measurement. 6 feet, 6 miles, 6 years, not without feeling, but without needing me to do anything about it. "I'm sorry," I said. "He had a good life," she said, "and a fast death. I've come to think that's as much as a person can reasonably ask." She stood up and went back to what she'd been doing, and I lay there on that cot and looked at the ceiling of a dead man's house and thought about the jar of honey. I stayed 11 days. I would like to tell you that by the end of those 11 days I had figured her out, but that would be a lie. Celestina Vera was not a woman who could be figured out in 11 days or 11 years. She had layers the way a canyon wall has layers. You could see them from a distance and know they were there, but getting down to the bottom of them was a different proposition entirely. What I could tell was this: she ran that homestead alone. 40 acres, a small herd of cattle, chickens, a kitchen garden she'd already put to bed for winter, but that had clearly been something in season. The dried stalks were still standing in neat rows. She rode, she fenced, she hauled water, she split wood. I watched her from the window once I could sit up, watched her come out of the barn in the gray morning with a load of something on each arm and not break stride, and I thought, this woman has never waited for anyone to do a thing for her. She fed me twice a day. Something with beans and dried venison the first few days, then eggs, then eventually a stew that had enough chili in it to get my blood moving again. She changed the dressings on my side with a matter-of-fact efficiency that made it clear she dealt with wounds before her husband's, I assumed, working stock country being what it was. She didn't make conversation while she did it. She made assessments, said healing clean, or still draining, the way a man checks the weather, useful information without sentiment attached. At night she sat by the stove and read. She had a small shelf of books, a Spanish Bible, a battered almanac, 2 or 3 others I couldn't make out from the cot. She read with the lamp close to her face, closer than you'd expect. I noticed that, but I didn't say anything. It wasn't my business. She asked me, on the 3rd night, what I'd done before the work that got me shot. I told her some of it. The scouting, the cattle work. I skipped the tracking and the range detective years, not because I was ashamed exactly, but because I didn't want to watch her face change, and I was honest enough with myself by then to admit that I cared whether it did. She listened without interrupting, which is rarer than people think. When I finished, she said, "You've seen a lot of country." "More than I needed to," I said. "No such thing," she said, and went back to her book. On the 5th day, I was able to get up and sit at the table. She put coffee in front of me, real coffee, black and strong, not the chicory substitute most places served in those years, and sat across from me, and we had the first real conversation. Not information, not medical assessment. A conversation. She was from New Mexico originally. Her father had been a small rancher, one of the old Spanish land-grant families that the territory had been slowly swallowing since the war. She'd married Domingo Vera when she was 20, followed him north into Wyoming territory, helped him build the place from a claimed stake and a borrowed wagon. They'd had 2 children. Both died, one in infancy, one at 3 years old from a fever. She told me that plainly, the same way she'd told me everything else, and when she saw what must have shown on my face, she said, Don't. I've made my peace with it. It took a long time, but I have. I asked her if she'd thought about leaving, after Domingo died. She looked at me steadily. Where would I go? She said. This is my land, we built it, my children are buried on it. She picked up her cup. A person doesn't leave the place where the dead are, not if they're worth anything. I didn't have anything to say to that. It was the truest thing I'd heard in a long time. We sat with the quiet for a while, the stove ticking, the wind pushing at the windows. Then she said, without looking at me, "What happened to you, Caleb, before all the rest of it?" What happened first? And I don't know why I told her. I'd kept it to myself for 40 years, or kept most of it, told the parts that explained the facts and left the rest buried. But she asked it like she was asking about weather. Like it was just a thing she wanted to know, and she didn't need anything from the answer except the truth. So I told her about my father's ranch in Texas. About being 18 and my father dying and the mortgage coming due before the cattle were sold and the bank taking everything in the time it took me to ride to town and back. About watching a man I'd never met walk through the house we'd built and point at things and say, that, and that, and that, while 2 other men wrote it down. About leaving with a saddle and a horse and no money and nothing else. And about swearing, quietly, in the way of somebody who means it, that no one would ever be able to walk through anything of mine that way again. The life I'd led was not unrelated to that morning. That's what I was telling her, not excusing it, just connecting the parts. She was quiet for a while after I finished. Then she said, "A man who lost his land when he was 18 and has been trying to get back to solid ground ever since." I looked at her. "That's you," she said. "That's what I see." She didn't say it with pity. She didn't say it like it was meant to fix me or redeem me or make me feel better about the things I'd done. She said it the way you describe a landscape. Accurate, attentive. Like she'd looked at me long enough to see the real shape. I put my coffee down and looked out the window. "You're sharp," I said finally. "I've had a lot of time alone to think," she said, and the corner of her mouth did that thing again, that almost smile, and I felt something move in my chest that had nothing to do with the cracked bone in my shoulder. On the 7th day, I was well enough to help. It was small things. I couldn't lift anything with my right arm, and the side still ached if I twisted wrong. But I could use my left hand, and I had both legs under me. I patched a section of fence that had been worrying me since I'd first seen it from the window, the post leaning and the wire going slack. She watched me do it from the barn doorway without saying anything, and when I came back, she handed me a cup of water and said, "The east section's been bothering me for a month." "I can see that," I said. "I would have gotten to it." "I know you would have." She nodded, accepting that, and went back in the barn. That was how it was between us. No performance. No one offering more than they meant, just the work and the honesty and the coffee in the morning. I thought about her at night when I should have been sleeping. I won't dress it up as anything other than what it was. I was a 60-year-old man who had gone without warmth for long enough that I'd forgotten what it felt like. And here was a woman who had talked to me like I was worth talking to, who had fed me and tended to me and sat across from me in lamplight and said without flinching that she saw what I was. I was not confused about the distance between what I wanted and what was reasonable to want. But I thought about her. And I was careful, because of that, not to make anything out of ordinary decency. Some men can't tell the difference between a woman being kind and a woman being interested. And I had watched that confusion cause enough damage in my life that I was determined not to be another example of it. She had saved my life, essentially, by dragging me off her yard and spending 11 days making sure I didn't die in her spare room. That was the whole of her obligation to me. Anything else I read into it was my own wishful thinking, and I was old enough to know the difference. Or I thought I was. On the 9th day, I went out to the barn in the early morning to check on my horse and found Celestina standing in the back of the barn near the hay, completely still, facing slightly away from me. She hadn't heard me come in. The barn cat was sitting up on the rail post in front of her, and she was reaching for it, her hand moving in a long, slow arc in the wrong direction, 6 inches wide, easy, of where the cat actually was. The cat was watching her hand go past, mildly interested. I stopped. I watched her hand adjust. Not quickly, not like she'd seen where she was missing and corrected. Slowly, like she was listening for something, like she was solving a problem by feel, working it out by other means. She found the cat, scratched under its chin. The cat leaned into it, and she smiled, a full smile, which I realized in that moment I had not yet seen, and then she turned her head and saw me standing in the barn doorway. The smile didn't disappear. It changed slightly, became steady set. "You move quiet," she said. "Old habit," I said. She turned back to the cat. I came in and checked my horse's feet and didn't say anything. After a while she said, "You saw." "Saw what?" I said, which was stupid, but I said it. "My left eye," she said. "The reach." I didn't answer right away. I had been turning it over. The lamp held close when she read. The way she always set the cup on my right side, never my left. The slight angle of her head when she looked at something, like she was putting her right eye forward. Small things. Things that made perfect sense now and hadn't before. "Since when?" I said. 13 years, she said. "A horse. He put his head back and caught me in the temple. I went dark over about 6 months and then it was gone." I sat down on the edge of the water trough. "You work this place alone with one eye." "I work it with one good eye and one that still catches light sometimes," she said, and the way she said it, slightly correcting me, precise about the facts, was so completely her that I almost laughed. "I know where everything is. I built the system. It's only when things are new or out of place that I have to think about it." "Like a stranger in your barn." "Like a stranger in my barn," she agreed. I was quiet. There was something happening in me that I hadn't given her permission for. It wasn't pity. She would have known pity at 50 yards, and she was already looking at me with an expression that said she was waiting to see which kind of man I was going to be. "Does it trouble you?" I said. "To tell people?" "I don't tell people," she said. "You told me." She was quiet for a moment. "You would have figured it out eventually." "Maybe," I said, "or maybe you just decided I should know." She looked at me, directly at me, her right eye meeting mine, and something crossed her face that I didn't quite have a name for, except that it wasn't nothing. It was the opposite of nothing. "You've been careful," she said, "since you could get around to not ask for more than is decent." I didn't know what to say to that. "Most men aren't careful," she said. "I've noticed." "I'm trying to be worth the care you put into keeping me alive," I said, which was more honest than I'd intended, but it was out, and I let it stand. She picked up the cat and set him on her shoulder, where he immediately settled like he'd been doing it all his life. "You are," she said, simply, no adornment, the way she said everything. And then she walked out of the barn, and I sat there on the edge of the water trough with my heart doing something that it hadn't done in close to 20 years. On the 10th day, the Holt brothers found me. There were 2 of them now, not 3. I'd learn later that the youngest, Eli Holt, had gotten himself killed in a separate piece of business not related to me, which left Roy and James, and what they lacked in numbers they made up for in persistence. They came in just before dusk, which is the worst time, enough light to see by, not enough to see clearly, everything the same shade of purple shadow. I was out at the far corner of the east fence when I heard the horses. 2, moving at a walk, and something about the gate, careful, spread wide apart, told me they weren't passing through. I had a rifle. I'd borrowed it from the rack inside her door 3 days before when I'd gone back to riding the property line with her, and she'd handed it down without a word. I brought it up now and moved into the scrub at the edge of the fence line and waited. They came up from the south draw, 1 on each side, which is how you come at a place when you know what you're doing. Roy Holt I recognized, big man, reddish beard, scar across the chin from something long-heeled. The other James I'd only seen once before, younger, thinner, the kind of quiet that isn't easy. They were looking at the house. The house where Celestina was. That thought did something to my thinking, clarified it. I stopped calculating and went still, the way you go still before a shot that matters. But I was 60 yards out, with a cracked shoulder on my shooting side, and my left-hand shooting was always adequate and never exceptional. The distance and the light were against me. If I fired and missed even 1 clean shot, they'd both be moving and Celestina would be between us. I was calculating this, how fast I could cover 60 yards with a bad shoulder, whether I could get inside the angle of one of them, when I heard the door. She came out onto the step. She had a shotgun, which I didn't know she had, leveled and easy, the butt snugged against her right shoulder so the right eye was behind the bead. And she was already looking at Roy Holt before he'd even registered she was there. "Off my land," she said. Her voice was exactly the same as it always was, not raised, not frightened, decided. Roy Holt had his hand near his pistol, and he took a moment before he moved it away. He was reading her, trying to figure out how serious the situation was. "We're looking for a man," he said, "Caleb Dross. We have business with him." "There's no one here but me," she said, "and you're on my land without being asked. Get off it." "Ma'am, we're not looking for trouble with you." "I know what you're looking for," she said, "and I'm telling you there's nothing on my land that belongs to you. You've got until I decide to stop talking." She moved the barrel slightly, the smallest motion, just a fractional shift in aim that dropped the muzzle to center mass, and Roy Holt made a decision. He held up his hand to James. He looked at the house one more time, and then he looked at the woman with the shotgun, and whatever he saw there, it settled him. "We'll be back," he said. "You can try," she said. They turned and rode back the way they'd come, and she stood on that step and watched them go until they were out of sight in the draw. I came across the field at a walk. She heard me coming, turned her head to pick me up on her right side, and lowered the shotgun. "How long were you there?" she said. "Long enough to know I wasn't needed." She looked at me. "You were there the whole time." 60 yards off with a bad shoulder and dying light," I said. "You had the better shot." She looked at the tree line where the Holts had gone. "I know land like I know my own hands," she said. "I know every angle and every distance on this property. I know exactly where a man would stand if he came up that draw." She tapped the barrel of the shotgun. It wasn't a guess. And then I understood it. What I'd thought was fearlessness or stubbornness or plain nerve, it was calculation. It was a woman who had been working that property for 12 years, alone for 6, who knew every shadow and every sight line, who had compensated for what she'd lost by building a kind of knowledge so precise and so specific to that ground that on her own land, in her conditions, she was better than most men with 2 good eyes. She had faced down Roy Holt with 1 good eye and 12 years of homework. I stood there in the half-dark and felt something that I don't have a clean word for. Respect, yes, but it was more than that. It was the feeling of seeing somebody for who they actually are, without any of the assumptions you walked in with, and finding that the real thing is so much more than you expected that it's almost disorienting. "Come inside," she said. "I'll make coffee." I did not sleep that night. Not because I was worried about the Holts. They'd made their calculation and they weren't coming back, not that night anyway. Men like that needing time to rework the arithmetic when the situation doesn't go their way. I lay on the cot and listened to the stove settle and thought about a woman standing on a step in failing light with a shotgun, already knowing where to aim. Thought about what it took to run that place alone, quietly, without telling anyone that the full picture of things was harder than it looked. To have the barn laid out just so, and the water trough just here, and the fence posts counted from the gate so you could walk the line in the dark without coming up short or long. To develop 12 years of knowledge so dense and specific that it replaced what she'd lost with something else, something harder to shake than ordinary sight. She hadn't told me. She'd hidden it, not out of shame, I didn't think, but because it wasn't anyone's business, and because the kind of woman she was didn't offer up what could be used against her. She'd lived alone with it and adapted around it and gotten on. And then I came bleeding into her yard, and she'd hauled me in and kept me alive and never said a word. I thought about the jar of honey. Somebody tends to things. Somebody cares whether things survive the winter. In the morning I was up before she was, which surprised me, because in 11 days I had never beaten her to the stove. I got the fire going and put the coffee on, and when she came out in her shawl, hair loose, she stopped in the doorway of the kitchen and looked at me, and for a moment her face was completely open, no mask, no reserve. And what was on, it was just a kind of unguarded feeling that a person can't fake and shouldn't try to. It lasted only a moment. Then she came in and sat down and put her hands around the cup I'd already set out on her right side. "You didn't sleep," she said. "No. Thinking about them." "Thinking about you," I said. She was quiet. "I want to ask you something," I said, "and I want you to hear it like I mean it and not like it's pity, because it isn't." She nodded. "I'd like to stay on," I said, "if you need help with what's coming, winter and the fence work and the question of the Holts coming back." "I can manage those things," she said. "I know you can," I said. "I watched you manage one of them last night. I'm not offering because I think you can't. I'm offering because I want to be here." She looked down at her cup. Her thumb moved around the rim slowly. You've been careful, she said again more quietly. I'm trying to be honest, I said. Those are sometimes the same thing. She was quiet for so long that I thought she was going to say no. That she was going to thank me and tell me I'd healed up enough and send me north with my horse and a jar of something from her larder. And that was going to be the right answer, and I was going to have to accept it. Then she said, there's a lot of fence. I said I saw that. And the south barn wants a new roof before the heavy snow. I can do that left-handed. She looked up at me, her right eye clear and dark and steady. I'm not easy to live around, she said. I'm not easy to live around, I said. We'll be even. And this time it was the real smile, not the corner of the mouth, not the acknowledgement. The whole thing, unguarded, the way I'd seen it in the barn with the cat. It changed her face so completely that I had to look away for a second, the way you look away from something bright. Coffee's ready, she said. I know, I said. I made it. The Holt brothers came back in February. Just Roy by then. James had taken sick over the winter, bad enough that he was done traveling, and Roy came alone, which was a different kind of foolish than coming with company. He rode up the main track mid-morning, and this time he could see me in the yard before he got close, could see that I was there and intended to stay, and he pulled up about 40 yards out and we looked at each other across the cold air. Celestina came out and stood on the step. Roy looked at me and then he looked at her, and he did the math. 3 months of winter between then and the last time he'd come, and I was still there, which meant something, and there were 2 of us looking at him across the yard, which meant something else. He sat on his horse for a while, long enough that it would have been stupid to say he hadn't considered his options. Then he turned around and rode back out the track. I don't know where Roy Holt went after that. South, I'd assume. There was nothing for him here, and he was smart enough to know it by then. I turned around and Celestina was watching the track where he'd gone, her right eye working the distance, and when she was satisfied he wasn't coming back, she looked over at me. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Her hand came up and touched my arm, just briefly, the way you check that something solid is still there, and then she went back inside. I stood in the yard in the February cold and looked at the track and the trees and the long pale sky, and I thought, I did not plan this. I did not plan any of this. I came down off a ridge bleeding out, and a woman I'd never met pulled me off her yard and kept me alive, and now I am standing on solid ground for the first time since I was 18 years old. She had not made a fuss about it. She had not announced it or named it or asked me for promises I might not be able to keep. She had just, over coffee and fence wire and the long, quiet mornings of a Wyoming winter, let me be what I was. Let me be of use. Let me matter. A woman with one good eye had seen me more clearly than most people see with 2. I wrote down some of this the following spring, when the roads were open enough that a man could get to town for paper and ink. Not to share it. Just because there are things that happen to you that you don't want to lose. Things you want to be able to look at and verify, the way you'd look at a deed. By then I knew what I'd been in that life, what the work had made me, and what I'd allowed. I wasn't finished being honest about it, and I don't know if I ever will be. But I also knew this. I had been looked at one honest morning across a pine table that had been scrubbed to silver by a woman who read people the way she read land, by what was really there, not by what she expected to see, and she had named what I was without making it less. Had seen the wound in it and also the other thing underneath, the part that was still worth something, still capable, still in it. And she had stayed. Not from softness, not from need exactly, from what I can only call judgment. The clear-eyed judgment of a woman who had built 12 years of knowledge in place of one missing thing and did not give her trust to anything she hadn't personally verified. I have been a lot of things in my life. The thing I am most grateful for is that she verified me. The jar of honey is still on the table. Somebody tends to things. Celestina put up 6 more jars last summer, and they're lined up on the shelf next to the Spanish Bible, and in the morning light they go amber and gold. And I look at them sometimes when I'm drinking my coffee and she's already out at the barn, starting the first of the things that need doing. There is always something that needs doing. That is the truth of this kind of life, and I have found, late in my years, that I do not mind it. That a day of work on land that matters with a woman who sees you is the thing I was after all along and didn't have words for until I found it on the floor of somebody else's yard, half dead, fixed on a jar of honey. I don't know how much time I have. A man my age doesn't get to be foolish about that. But I'll tell you what I know for certain. The south barn held through 2 winters with that roof I put on left-handed, and the east fence has not given us a minute of trouble since I reset those posts. And there is coffee on this table every morning, 2 cups, and hers is on the left. She is not sentimental about it. Neither am I. But I put it on her left every morning. And every morning she picks it up.